2.
Kia ora everyone, welcome to another episode of Politics in Full Sentences, your weekly dose of political happenings from the week, with a good lashing of free markets and free minds. And I'm your host Ruwan Premathilika, and joining with me today is familiar faces, Mr. David Seymour, the leader of the ACT Party.
G'day.
And ACT Party's number 3 from last election, Brooke van Velden. Welcome.
Thanks for having me back.
It's great to have you both here. Now, jump straight into it. There's probably something that's gonna be closer to ACT. Obviously, I've heard the Justice Minister Andrew Little calling ACT's 3 strikes policy, comparing it to fascism. What are your thoughts? So who wants to go first?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's sort of a compliment. And I know you'll think, why is that? Well, because, I mean, they'd know. I mean, this is the guy who wants to introduce restrictions on what you can say from the government that rushed the firearm laws through Parliament with no consultation of any meaningful kind. So, you know, when they say you're fascist, I think for them that's probably actually sort of a compliment. But in all seriousness, you know, they can't be serious. I mean, the 3 strikes law says that if you commit a sexual or violent crime, the first time you get sentenced just like anyone else.
Yeah.
The second time you get sentenced just like anyone else. I think that's pretty reasonable. If you do it 3 times, then you get the maximum sentence for that crime. Now, I think that's actually very sensible. It does actually give people a second chance. In fact, it gives people 2 second chances. But if you commit a violent or sexual offence and get convicted 3 times, you should go away for a long time. Now, fascism, on the other hand, is a political ideology of suppressing speech, suppressing freedom of expression, suppressing freedom of movement, forcing people to adhere to one big government agenda.
Yeah.
And in all seriousness, I don't think that the Labour Party are fascist, not for a moment.
Yeah.
But if anyone's closer to it in New Zealand right now, it's much more them than us.
Yeah. No, look, I'm glad you actually explained the description of what a fascist stands for, because it's quite a loose word that's just thrown around just to I guess almost win political points. I mean, look, having sort of grown up here and having seen some even friends, it's actually really hard to actually get a criminal conviction. I know there's been some people that's gotten into fights, they've been charged with things. I mean, first of all, I think you actually get a diversion, if I'm not mistaken. If you have a clean record, you can get a diversion. If you're young.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Look, I just see it's an absurd statement from the Justice Minister. I mean, there was a survey that was released just last week, and it said that 77% of victims don't feel safe. And I think there was another part of that survey, and it said around 83% of people don't feel safe in the criminal justice system. And that was a survey that was conducted a year on from Andrew Little standing up at a criminal justice forum and saying, look, we're going to put victims at the heart of any criminal justice reform.
Well, that's really interesting you say that, because I remember being at the parliamentary opening. It was, I guess Jacinda Ardern opened parliament by saying we put children at the forefront of everything we do, and the first thing they did was attack charter schools, which was making a difference. And I guess these are all ACT's flagship policies that are being attacked. First the charter schools, and now 3 strikes.
Yeah, look, and I just look at 3 strikes and I say, well, are we going to put victims first or offenders? Because seriously, there was the first person convicted for his 3rd strike last year. It was a man called Hayes Waitokia, and he'd done 14 serious, he'd been convicted 14 times previously. And for his first strike, it was a violent offence. Second time, he sexually assaulted someone who was 17, and then the 3rd time he stabbed someone. And I just look at that and say, yes, he should be locked up for a maximum sentence. I mean, do you want people like that out on the streets potentially convicting again Or do you actually want to make people feel safe?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I mean, you're talking about 3 strikes. I know Mike Loader we had on the show a few episodes ago, and he was talking about obviously making it harder, increasing the penalties for, I guess, gun-related crimes. How would this affect into 3 strikes law as it stands, David? So, if you could please explain.
Well, if you committed 3 crimes with a firearm, that would be a violent crime, and it would be caught under 3 strikes. So you get the maximum sentence on your 3rd one. So far as what Mike's talking about, and I fully endorse this. We've just seen the government punish New Zealanders for the crime of owning a firearm. In effect, we don't do enough to punish criminals who commit crimes with firearms. So you had a big group over here of licensed firearm owners. They actually commit very little, if any, gun crime.
Yeah.
I think 1% of all gun crime is committed by them.
Yeah.
And that's in a way not surprising, because licensed firearm owners have to go through a fit and proper person test and so on. So you'd expect them to be more law-abiding people.
That's right.
And yet, you've got other people who commit crimes with firearms, and they don't really get the book thrown at them the way that you'd kind of expect if we really thought that firearms were really dangerous and bad and something we should be cracking down on. So, let's start punishing people who commit crime with firearms, and let's stop punishing people for the so-called crime of being a firearm owner.
Yeah. I saw as an interesting thing on Facebook, I think it was, somebody comparing it to, banning all sober drivers from driving in order to protect them. So that's effectively letting just the drunks go out on the roads, and let's ban all the sober drivers. So it'll only be the drunk drivers with the cars, and they'll be a threat to each other. So,
yeah, well, I think it was Clint Eastwood said gun control is like having a vasectomy or your tubes tied because your neighbour had too many kids. There's got to be something to that.
Well, if it looks like anything like Clint Eastwood, that could be a problem. Now, the other hot topic of the week, Jacinda Ardern, again, travelling the world, telling there should be, more women in politics. There should be, Australians should be doing more for this to counteract climate change. Has she got a point?
Oh, yeah. Well, look, I mean, I'm sure women will be underrepresented in Pacific countries, as they are in most countries' politics. I just don't quite get what Jacinda Ardern going over there and giving them a lecture is going to do to change something that's been a sort of a long-term cultural issue in those countries. And so far as climate change, it's very easy for New Zealand to lecture people because we're blessed that overwhelmingly our electricity is from hydro. Theirs comes from coal. So even if they switch to electric cars, it's probably actually worse off. Now,
That's
so
right.
again, I don't see how Jacinda Ardern lecturing them solves that fundamental problem. But, what's kind of interesting is I can't figure out why she didn't go over there and lecture them about how to build more houses, for instance. I mean, why didn't she go and lecture them? I can't work. Why didn't she lecture them about that?
Well, they don't have an RMA. You could just get into it and actually start building a house, I'm assuming. I don't know.
Well, the Aussies, I think, have done better at building more homes in the last few years than we have. But they do still have they don't have the Resource Management Act, but they have other similar problems. So I think there's the serious point here, though, is that there's some pretty major issues at home in New Zealand. And I think Jacinda Ardern, there was a good analysis in the Herald this week. She hasn't travelled overseas more than John Key did, but she seems to get a lot more attention for what she does overseas than what she does here. And in a way, that's probably good for her because the economy is not looking to flash. The major home building policy is not looking to flash. And so I can kind of understand why she goes.
David, is that really her fault? I mean, what is it that I mean, if she can go out, get media, represent New Zealand, why shouldn't she?
Well, it's a fair question, and I'd love to see her getting lots of media and flying the flag for New Zealand. I mean, we should be in favour of Prime Minister who's a good salesperson for the country. That's not my criticism that she's doing that. My criticism is that she's not doing the business at home.
Yeah.
So, the people that voted for her and gave her the ticket to attend these international fora, might ask, well, what's been the performance of the Labour government at home? And you'd have to say, pretty hopeless.
That's right. I think it's a serious lack of diplomacy, actually. I mean, she's gone out and essentially attacked one of our largest trading partners for something that's their internal politics.
Yeah.
I mean, how would she feel if Scott Morrison just, started attacking her for the failed Kiwi Build scheme?
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, I can't imagine she'd be quite happy. I think really what it comes down to is, she's been on the cover of Vogue. She's consistently being brought up in these democratic debates, being told that she's a mastermind and she has great policies and she's changing the world. And so she's going out there saying things, maybe she can change the world. But in fact, you can't get involved in other people's internal politics.
Yeah, look, I mean, I saw a few commentators come out. I even heard this term, virtue signaling at a global level, and it's, there's some comments from commentators like Alan Jones that came out fairly scathing of our Prime Minister. Look, I don't know. I don't think it'll actually affect any trade. I think
I can't imagine so.
Business people usually see past politics and just get on with what they got to do. And really quite interesting. Now, David, you wanted to talk about your new gun policy and.
Well, it's not mine. I mean, it's mine in that it's ACT and I lead ACT. But actually, what I'm really proud of with this policy for firearms. And you can go to fairfirearmlaws.act.org.nz and read it and sign up to it. But what I'm really proud about is the way that we've done this. So, after the laws were all changed and turned upside down in April, we said, right, what do we do about this? And we did the opposite of what the government did. So we actually got one of our board members, James McDowell, represents ACT in the Waikato, and he is a long-term firearm guy, member of a club, collects and so on, got a lot of contacts in the community, and actually consulted with a whole lot of people, and they collaborated, and they've produced a policy that's got an amazing response from the licensed firearm community. So I'm proud of the policy, but I'm also proud of the way that we've done it, because I actually think that the firearm community were kind of scapegoated and almost blamed for a terrible tragedy because of the way that they were treated, that a bad thing's happened, now we're going to take your rights away. It's almost as though it was their fault when it wasn't. And so we've gone and done the opposite, a much more collaborative process.
Yeah, no, I remember at the time, 1 week out from the tragic shooting on March 15th, that you were quite outspoken about it, saying, hey, look, you have to follow the democratic process, which was obviously, we did a
correct select committee and all that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, look, we're just standing up to bullying, but I mean, just a rundown. I mean, first of all, you reinstate the E category so that people with proper vetting and registration can have centrefire semi-automatics. We question whether the police should be the administrator of the Arms Act, because they seem pretty bad at it. We're saying that we shouldn't have increased centralisation. You actually need to have arms officers of some sort actually out in the community talking to people face to face, because there are people that shouldn't have firearms, and when you have an electronic registry, it's a lot harder to find out who they are. Have
you included the data matching with Australia?
Yeah, look, I don't think we have. I mean, that is something that came up in the last podcast.
That's right,
and didn't come out of the process that we went through.
I found that quite fascinating, because that surely leaves a big loophole.
Well, it certainly could have made a lot of difference to the tragedy in Christchurch, but also just crazy things like the magazine capacities. We're going to 7 for shotguns, 10 for all other centrefire, and 15 for rimfire. Having a 10-round magazine capacity for rimfires has meant there's all of these tubular 22s, which are not dangerous at all. I mean, you've got to put the rounds in one at a time. I mean, they're not useful for any sort of violence. Very old-fashioned firearms, but
mostly
many of them have
collectibles. I take it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are over 100 years old, but many of them have a magazine that can hold 12. So all of them, or a great number of them, have been outlawed, and it's just nuts. So we'd change those magazine limits so that we don't inadvertently ban a whole lot of firearms that are actually useful.
Yeah, it's important what you said about the ability of the police to handle this, because you'd posted, was it you or from the ACT page? I'm actually not too sure, but there was a message about a notice at a police station saying, "Do not bring your guns in, leave it in the car, and come talk to us." And turns out the police were encouraging the people to break the law. Is this fake news, or is this an true story?
Well, it's true that the rules say you should not leave a firearm unattended in a vehicle, and it's also true that the police, worried about being inundated with people trying to hand in their firearms, which hasn't happened, by the way. The police actually put a sign on the front door saying "Leave your firearms in the car." So you either disobey the police or break the law. It's not a great choice to be given.
It could be quite intimidating if somebody's going to walk in with a firearm to a police
of course,
station.
But I am always reluctant to beat on the police. I think the police have been put in a really difficult circumstance here, and as a result, we should be blaming Parliament that put them in this position rather than the police, who by and large are very good people.
Yeah. Look, I want to go back to 3 strikes. Now, David, if you had to review that law, are there any changes you would make?
No, look, I think the process that ACT went through back in 2008-9 was a really good process. It is a good law. It's not excessive like the Californian one, where you steal a loaf of bread and you go away for life. It's only for very serious crimes, and it's incremental. And I just defy anyone to explain why someone should get off lightly on their 3rd, conviction for a sexual or violent offence.
Yeah, there was. I agree. I think the 3-strike law is working well, and in fact, judges, they really do actually hand out a maximum sentence. So this is for very serious offenders.
There's been a couple of, I guess, how do you captain's calls where they've chosen not to hand out the maximum penalty. I mean, this is a frustration that I'm sure as victims, and public also feel a little bit frustrated about, because I want to go back to David, what dare I say, it was 2017 leading into the election. You spoke about educating prisoners.
Yeah.
How would that fit into this law, or is that a completely separate thing?
Oh, well, they're the same concept. Like, I'm all for second chances and I'm all for rehabilitation. I think it's just nuts that we do very little to upskill prisoners when they're in prison. And half of them are back inside within 4 years of release. Alan Duff is really good on this in his new book. He says, look, it's just nuts. You give people $320. What do? Go back to their old gang associates and end up back in prison almost straight away. We've got to do better than that. We can do better at rehabilitating people. But on the other hand, if people have had a couple of chances and they're still, vandalising and hurting other people, then we should throw the book at them and put them away for a long time.
I mean, the crimes we're talking about is not, simple crimes. I mean, they're actually killing people and raping people. I mean, that's a massive thing to be let off lightly on those charges. We're not making society any safer. And those are the things I'd love to see that's being addressed.
There was actually another really interesting article that came out this week, and it was about someone in the youth court. And he had admitted in court that he had raped 2 girls who were underage. And because he had admitted it, he got no sentence, no punishment at all, apart from putting his name down on, it was put on his record. But it was also noted that he wasn't given any sort of serious punishment because he was some sort of sports star. And of course you do get name suppression when you're in the youth court, but it kind of it struck me that we do have this kind of weird culture in New Zealand where we let people who are sports stars get away with more than if they're just an ordinary member of society. And it's something that we've seen all over the years, people getting name suppression because somehow they represent us overseas.
Yeah,
I don't want to be represented by
actually,
these people.
I recall this. I remember actually seeing this, an article about where the family were warned that should they release the name of this person, that they would be prosecuted.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a hard position. I mean, if somebody, was a relative of mine, I probably
agree.
wouldn't give a damn. You'd still go out and
well, no, you'd be really angry, of course. But I just, it does raise a problem in our justice system, I think, where it's unequal.
Yeah.
Some people, just because of their careers, they get off with crimes with a lighter sentence. And I wonder whether it would be possible to actually say, hey, you know what, judges shouldn't take a person's career into account if they are actually raping people.
Yeah, there's got to be some sort of consistency in the law. I guess that's really one of the challenges, and I think that consistency is what's lacking here. And guys, any last thoughts? Any other topics you want to talk about?
Oh, there was that one about Andrew Little once again. Coming out and saying that maybe he wants to give prisoners the right to vote again.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
How do you feel about that, David?
I just can't get excited about it either way. I mean,
what's the prison population?
About 10,000.
Okay.
So, but here's the thing. I mean, there's one group of people saying that you should lose your right to vote and it's the end of the world if you can, and all right-thinking New Zealanders are storming the barricades to deny prisoners the right to vote. And then there's people saying if prisoners can't vote, it's the end of the world, and we can't look at ourselves in the mirror as a proper civilized country. And I just can't get excited about either position. I mean, look, when you go to prison, you lose a bunch of rights. Some you keep, like you can't legally be beaten or denied of basic human rights, and some you lose. So you can't. I mean, the obvious thing about being in prison is you can't leave. You lose a lot of other rights, such as the right to write letters to people and perpetrate hateful Nazi rhetoric in theory, but apparently you can do that now. Now, why the right to vote is a particularly important right. Well, I lived in Canada for 5 years, and I had all the normal rights and freedoms. I could move around the country. I could earn money. I could spend money. I could, meet people, form relationships. Work, do all the things that you do in life. I was never able to vote, and I didn't feel like a sort of a second-class citizen or something. Is
this another level of virtue signaling, essentially?
Well, and look, it's 10,000 people, most of whom probably won't bother to vote anyway. So I just can't get excited about it. And, Simon and the Nats is all rah, rah, rah. And, Labour have decided that this is like something they want to do something about, even though their economic policy is hopeless. And
look, talking of economic policy, I know we've been very critical of some of the things. And look, you're in charge, David. Next week, what are you going to do? What's your priority?
Well, I'm very excited about next week because we're having Ruth Richardson on the podcast. So she's coming on Politics in 4 Sentences. Yeah, and she'd know what to do. But look, I mean, if we were serious, what we'd be saying is that our policy settings haven't really changed for 30 years. And it's really interesting to go through the legislation that sort of forms the basis of economic policy. So the Reserve Bank Act, 1989, the Income Tax Act, 1986, Education Act, 1989, Resource Management Act, 1991. Wow. The State-Owned Enterprises Act. Did you know you have a share or whole ownership of 28 SOEs? That was 1986. The Public Finance Act, also 1989. So you can go through all of these.
So you're talking reforms.
Yeah, serious building blocks of the way New Zealand is today and economic policy in New Zealand today. And it was all done 30 years ago. We've been on cruise control, and it's time to come off cruise control. So, that's why ACT talks about big, hairy, audacious ideas that would actually make New Zealand a better place. I mean, we should have one rate of income tax. It's so simple. And culturally, we're saying to people, if you study, improve yourself, work hard, do overtime, invest, start a company, save your money, invest more, then actually you deserve to keep that money.
That's right.
Whereas what the current policy says is, if you start doing well, we'll triple your tax rate just to really show you that it's not really your money. So flat tax is an obvious thing that a courageous government would do. We talked about education. We'd say, look, we're spending $250,000 on your kids' education. So what we're going to do is actually
1 week, mate. Only 1 week. Start with one.
Yeah, well, it'll be a week of rapid reform. You'd replace the Resource Management Act. You wouldn't have a 30-year-old law that is basically stopping people from developing their property and becoming prosperous. And then maybe in week 2 we'd do a little bit more stuff around regulation, because that's a major problem holding us back. But I'd be excited if I was in charge. We'd have some real reform. And I tell you one thing that would happen: if you had a 17.5% company tax rate, investment would pour in from overseas and in New Zealand. Would become like a Singapore or Hong Kong. Yeah. It'd be damn exciting, and we'd actually be able to solve the social problems that the lefties are always whinging about.
That's right.
But anyway, unfortunately, the voters didn't put me in charge, so we'll just have to suffer on as a country until they do.
Well, you've got a good team. You got Brooke behind you, and a lot of new people I hear that are coming on board. So well done, and till next week. Thanks for joining, and thank you everyone for tuning in at home and listening on the podcast. And I want to first, before I go, say thank you to Podcast Instead, Christian. You guys do a great job. So thank you. Have a great week, and see you next week.
All right, cheers, mate.
Bye.